Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to present our next speaker, a pillar in the JFK assassination research, Dr. James Fetzer, who's going to speak about revision and deception in the Zapruder film. Jim Fetzer.
I have an unplanned preface in response to Gordon's remarks, some of which may actually be true. But the meeting at the home of Clint Murchison Sr. was not a victory meeting, it was a ratification of going forward. It was not a mob shoot, and James Files was not among the shooters. And Lyndon Johnson was a pivotal player. Indeed, if you want an outline, you have to distinguish between the sponsors, the individuals and groups who wanted Lyndon out, Jack out and Lyndon in, primarily for reasons of policy, with the exception of the anti-Castro Cubans who simply wanted revenge. The mechanics included, and I've identified 6 that appear to be right. No one has disputed them. One of whom is a Dallas deputy sheriff, one of whom is an Air Force expert, another of whom is a Dallas police officer, another of whom is an anti-Castro Cuban, another of whom is a CIA mafia guy, and another of whom is Lyndon Johnson's hitman. So I'm going to explain what my research collaborative has led me to conclude. But I want to give a story about the origins of the assassination, for which you must return to the convention in Los Angeles in 1960. Jack had decided to invite Stuart Symington of Missouri to run with him on the ticket, and Bobby went by the Johnson suite to make a pro forma invitation to Lyndon, who was powerful majority leader, was not expected to accept, and was startled when Lyndon jumped on it. He hadn't been on Bobby or Jack's long list, much less their short, but he threatened to expose that Jack suffered from Addison's disease, was not expected to live a long, healthy life, that he'd had dalliances with beautiful women, some of whom were agents for a foreign government, in particular East Germany, information he'd obtained from J. Edgar Hoover, and where he assured Bobby that if he were not on the ticket, that any legislative proposal sent down from the White House would be dead on arrival, because as majority leader he would bottle them up. Bobby and Jack anguished over this, but they couldn't figure a way out and accepted Lyndon on the ticket. When one of Lyndon's primary financial sponsors heard of it, he burst into the Johnson suite cursing and swearing. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles and said he thought that was an excellent plan. Bobby Baker would later state that Jack Kennedy would not live out his term and that he would die a violent death. As president, Lyndon even sent his chief executive assistant, Cliff Carter, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. He was the one guy who could tie all the disparate elements together, and who would, after all, as the new president, be the only person in the world who could possibly guarantee that no one would ever suffer, ever pay any penalty, or be punished for participating in the assassination of his predecessor. Now, I offer in support the work of Noel Twyman. This is absolutely sensational. Noel not only made major contributions, I'll mention, to the study of the Zapruder film, but put together a brilliant analysis of the motivation and the principal groups. In addition, of course, Madeline Duncan Brown became convinced that Lyndon was a primary player. I had over 100 interviews with Madeline. Another was Billy Saul Estes, a Texas legend, who also was convinced that Lyndon was the key player behind it. Another would be Barr McClellan, who is reported here. Indeed, so much of what the conference has presented was converging on those who actually were responsible, that I had thought I would begin by observing that since we already know a lot about who and why, that I'm going to explain how it was done in relation to the Zapruder film. But Gordon's unexpected presentation has led me to offer a preface as a form of correction in relation to my understanding of how these events came about. We also have, of course, the confession of E. Howard Hunt to St. John. He enumerated the chain of command from Lyndon Johnson to Gordon Meyer to David Adley Phillips to William Harvey to David Sanchez Morales. And we have, of course, Jack Ruby, who told reporters at the time that he wouldn't be in the position he was in and had someone else been vice president. And he cited Adlai Stevenson as an example. And they said, Jack, you're talking about the man at the top. And Jack assured them that he was. And of course, we have the absolutely sensational work of Philip Nelson, which extends the work of Robert Caro. You read the early Caro volumes, and you have no doubt at all about the narcissism, the egomania, the megalomania, the desire for control, the necessity to become the president of all the people of Lyndon Baines Johnson. And then when Caro gets the assassination, he peters out. He can't face it. He can't accept the conclusions of his own previous research, where Phil Nelson has admirably picked up the cudgels to bring the story to its completion. And of course, now we have Roger Stone, who's giving a elegant version of the bare bones account of what actually happened, and it's a very different story than we have just heard from Gordon Ferry. And in addition, even Craig Zerbel in the Texas Connection had this absolutely marvelous photograph on the back that I think captures the essence, because Jack was, behind his back was this incredibly sinister, manipulative, political genius of a man. Mention was made, by the way, about Jack not passing the Civil Rights Act. And that was because Lyndon kept telling him it wasn't time yet. It wasn't time yet. Lyndon knew full well that the time would only be right when he became president of the United States, and for which he would be so greatly admired in ignorance of his actual culpability in putting himself in that position. So that's my preface, and now I want to turn to the film. Can you go full screen?
That is full screen.
Okay.
Not 1080p.
Okay. This is the best available version of the Zapruder film. It's called the Costello Combined Cut. You can find it available for free as individual frames or as a complete sequence on assassination science and elsewhere. John restored some missing frames. Even in the MPI version, they had frames out of order. He took out pincushion and aspect ratio distortion. This is available for free, no copyright entanglements, no sixth floor or any of that. There were, of course, numerous indications that something was wrong with the film from the beginning. Abraham Zapruder, after all, had observed that he began filming when the motorcade came up Houston and started to turn on to Elm, and filmed continuously until the motorcade disappeared under the triple underpass. Well, you have this huge gap. You see it's just barely reaching the intersection, and then all of a sudden the limousine is at the Stemmons Freeway sign. There were other indications something was wrong. Look at the string of bystanders standing there looking on. Unlike every other location in Dallas, they're not waving and screaming enthusiastically. They're just standing there passively looking on, as though the president and Jackie were not actually there before them. And indeed, that appears to be the case, that particular foreground was filmed when the pilot car passed, and there was added when they revised the film to create what we have available now, using the sophisticated techniques of optical printing and special effects, whereby you can combine any foreground with any background. In addition, notice Mary Mormon and Jean Hill, Jean in the bright red coat, Mary beside her, where Mary was taking photographs. Jean was with her Polaroid. Jean was coating them with a preservative. They both stepped out into the street in order to take. Jean calls over, "Hey, Mr. President, look over here. We want to take your picture." When Mary Mormon was being interviewed by Gary Mack, aka Dunkel, for a documentary, Mary repeatedly kept stepping out into the street because that is what she had actually done. But Gary talked to her about they didn't want that. And when they finally had a take where she didn't actually step into the street, and he said, "We'll use that." I mean, the duplicity involved here is simply overwhelming, and there have been, individuals who would have been presumably authorities and custodians who have been deliberately obfuscating and distorting the truth. I'll continue with that thing. Another indication, of course, which Noel Twyman discerned, was that the Greer head turns are much too fast. Indeed, he hired a professional tennis player to determine how fast someone could turn their head from back to front and front to back, and he discovered that Greer is turning his head twice as fast as is humanly possible, which doesn't sound like much until you realize it turns a 4-minute mile into a 2-minute mile. And now if I can return to the slide set. So there's been lots of controversy, lots of discussion, but with regard to the turn, why there's that big gap, we know now it's because William Greer swung out too widely. He mistook the frontage road in front of the book depository for Elm Street, nearly hit a concrete abutment. Roy Truly, Oswald's supervisor, is crystal clear about this. Then he had to pull back into the center to get the vehicle back in line. But while that was an obvious gap, it was by no means the only significant feature of what actually happened on Elm Street, where,
Sorry about that.
this is fine, where John Costello and I co-edit assassinationresearch.com, which is an online journal for the advanced study of the death of JFK, and where John put together what happened on Elm Street, the eyewitnesses' speed, which runs 120 pages of just a compilation of what the witnesses actually said. So if you want to get a better idea of what happened on Elm Street, you read what the witnesses said, and you'll find, as I proceed, I'll be talking about what many of them reported. Here, of course, is the official scenario of 3 shots fired from the 6th floor of the book depository building by allegedly a Marine Corps shooter who was actually quite a mediocrity. I used to supervise marksmanship training and recruit training in San Diego, where I had 15 DIs and 300 recruits under my command. Oswald scored 212 in 1957, which was reasonable shooting. I fired 212 myself. The next year, however, 58, he didn't show up at the rifle range, which is extraordinary because there's a general order that every Marine from the lowest ranking private to the highest ranking general, the commandant of the Marine Corps himself, must qualify with a rifle every year, which told me he was on some special assignment. And then the following year, in 1959, he barely qualified with a 191. And that was probably a gift from the pits. I mean, he was such a bad shot that he frequently missed the target altogether, and they'd wave a flag known as Maggie's Drawers, which Oliver Stone mentioned in his magnificent work, JFK. Based upon extensive research on the medical evidence, and where I had the benefit of collaborating with the best experts, including a world authority on the human brain, who was also an expert on wound ballistics, a PhD in physics, who was also an MD and board certified in radiation oncology, who was an expert on the interpretation of x-rays. We have been able to ascertain that Jack was hit at least 4 times. He was in the back from behind. I'll explain the location of the shot from the county records building. He was hit in the throat from in front by a bullet that actually passed through the windshield. And then after the limousine was brought to a second halt in Dealey Plaza, he was hit twice in the head, once from behind and once from in front. So I'll go through the shooting sequence with you as I proceed. Here's an indication of what we know about it from Thomas Evan Robinson, who is the mortician who prepared the body for funeral. This man spent more time with JFK's body than anyone else in the world. You know, as he describes a gaping wound at the back of the head. He also talked about a 3-inch flap. I'm going to talk about that because when the frangible exploding bullet blew up, it actually opened up a flap in the vicinity of his ear, as well as creating shockwaves that blew a major hole in the back of his head, which had already been weakened by a prior shot. The identification of which has become a matter of extreme art because it's related to the Harper fragment, this rather substantial triangular chunk of skull that was blown out of the back of JFK's head. Notice he also mentions the wound to the back, which was about 6 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column. Recognition of that wound alone already establishes the existence of a conspiracy. It was a shallow shot, only went in about as far as the second knuckle on your little finger with no point of exit, which of course meant the throat wound was a wound of entry. And the HSCA made a simply absurd attempt to conceal what had actually happened by offering us this depiction of the wound. I mean, I will give you many descriptions of the fist-sized blowout at the back of the head, but here you don't see any such thing. They have a small entry wound at the top. I show this especially because they display the skull flap. Notice that to the right. I'm going to show you where we have discovered an actual photograph of the wound in the Zapruder film, and you will see this pink extension, which is that very skull flap they're depicting here. Then we have the absurdity of 3 grossly different descriptions of the wound. You have the very consistent depictions of the Parkland physicians. Fist-sized blowout, we get it from witnesses in Dealey Plaza, as you'll see Clint Hill describes it. It's even described that way in the Kennedy detail, which dumbfounded me since it was indicative of what the Secret Service knew about what actually happened, whereas I'm going to explain they set him up for the hit. In the middle, you see what happened when after the body was brought back to Bethesda from its detour to Walter Reed, where the best pathologists in the military took out bullet fragments. James Humes, who was in charge of the autopsy, as Cyril observed, had never performed an autopsy on a gunshot victim before, took a cranial saw to the skull at JFK to enlarge the wound to try to make it look like something that had been caused by a shot from behind. David Lifton was right on top of this. If you read the description in the autopsy report from Bethesda, which you all know was the original was burned and revised till they found something acceptable. It's this enormous wound. In fact, Lifton, when he read it, he was so dumbfounded, he called a physician and described it, and without identifying the patient, he said, "What does that sound like to you?" And he said, "It sounds like someone was hit in the head with an axe." I mean, it's just enormous. Now, the reason why William Evans Robinson wasn't taken in by the gross enlargement of the skull was because he was present when it took place. Douglas Horn, who was the senior analyst for military records for the Assassination Records Review Board, in his magnum opus, Inside the ARRB, reports how when they deposed Thomas Evan Robinson, they asked him about these dotted lines on the skull. He said, "Oh no, sir, the doctors did that." And he was there with another member of the medical staff when Humes performed this atrocity. So when he actually gave that summary of the wound, he didn't describe that massive. He knew it was an artifact. It had not been real. In addition, Cyril showed you this photograph, sometimes called the stare of death, and there are several things wrong about it. Charles Crenshaw, who did these diagrams, was the last physician to observe the body before it was wrapped in sheets and towel put around the head when placed into the bronze ceremonial casket, and he closed JFK's eyes at the time. He describes here what the wound looked like. It was a clean puncture wound. Very small, obviously a wound of entry. Before and after the trach, and you see the trach was just a simple straight line incision by Malcolm Perry. Here's Malcolm Perry. Afterwards, the Parkland press conference took place, and 3 times he described the wound as a wound of entry. Now, once again, that was so deleterious to the story the government wanted to spin that they messed with it, tried to make it look like it had been an exit wound instead of an entrance. In fact, Dr. Bob Livingston, who was a world authority on the human brain, with whom we collaborated and who contributed to assassination science, told us in reports there that he was called by Humes after he had made a previous phone call, having heard of the description of the small puncture wound to the throat and of the massive blowout to the back of the head, both of which were widely broadcast on radio and television that very day, that because of the wound to the throat, and this is so ironic in retrospect, if there were any evidence of shots from behind, then there had to have been a conspiracy, so the neck should be dissected very carefully. Well, Humes disregarded that, of course. They pretended they didn't know about the throat wound, but he did call Bob Livingston, who was an expert on wounds because he supervised an emergency medical hospital and during the Battle of Okinawa for injured Okinawans and Japanese prisoners of war. What would it have looked like if it had been an exit wound? And Bob proceeded to describe it, and Humes apparently took that description from Bob to alter the wound, just as he'd taken a cranial saw to the skull. I mean, a man who will do the one is certainly not going to hesitate to do the other. And here we have from the photograph taken by James I. Alchins in Dealey Plaza, probably the most important photograph related to the assassination. On the left, you see the small white spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center where the bullet passed through the windshield. And on the right, you see a subsequent windshield that was produced. They took the vehicle back to Ford on Monday. The day of the formal state's funeral was completely torn down and rebuilt, where Doug Weldon, an attorney from Kalamazoo, now deceased, did brilliant research, tracked down the official at Ford responsible for replacing the windshield, who confirmed that it had been a through-and-through bullet hole there. And though I didn't mention it before, if we went back to Thomas Evans Robinson, he mentions that there were these small holes, wounds in the face. He discovered those when he was embalming JFK, and embalming fluid came running out, which David brilliantly inferred was from tiny particles of glass when the bullet passed through the windshield that impacted JFK in the face. So there you have more proof of that bullet hole having passed through the windshield. And indeed, you can actually even see the bullet hole in the windshield in frame 225 of the Zapruder film. That's the extant film we have now, of course. And here, David, just for anyone who has any doubt, I mean, there's such a mass of evidence about the location of the wound to the back. I actually gave a lecture at Cambridge about this and then published it in an international peer-reviewed journal under the heading Reasoning About Assassinations. And I go through all the evidence, the shirt, the jacket, the autopsy report, Seabird and O'Neill's report, Admiral Berkeley's death certificate, which locates a wound to the back at the thoracic vertebrae, which corresponds to this location, about 6 inches below the collar to the right. When they did the reenactments of the shooting, they had a small patch at the back of the head and a larger one on the back at that location. I mean, anyone who thinks that the bullet landed anywhere else simply doesn't know the evidence. And where Gerald Ford, it fell to him to have the wound redescribed, is at the base of the back of the neck to facilitate the ridiculous magic bullet theory, which Cyril has so often and so ably savaged, just ripped apart. But notice here, the ultimate coup de grace is that such a passage of a bullet from the back of the neck to the throat wasn't even anatomically possible. David Manning took a patient with similar chest and neck dimensions and plotted the trajectory, and it's not possible because cervical vertebrae intervene. And here I mentioned in passing, when you look at these reenactments on Discovery or ABC or whatever, that they use models of JFK that doesn't have a backbone, which is of course doubly insulting because not only did Jack have a backbone, Jack had backbone.
Yeah. There you go.
But it's astonishing how easily a gullible American public that is largely scientifically illiterate, even about basic elements of anatomy, can be taken in. Here I want to explain as background to the alteration of the film what we know about the way in which the Secret Service set him up. First of all, as you heard Vince Palomar observe, they left 2 agents behind at Love Field. This is Henry Rick turning and shrugging his shoulders. What in the world's going on? These 2 guys would have been on the vehicle on the back or running beside it. They were left behind at Love Field by Emery Roberts. They didn't weld the manhole covers. They didn't cover the open windows. They allowed the crowd to spill out into the street. The 110th Military Intelligence Unit was ordered to stand down over the adamant opposition of its commanding officer. Look at this. Can anyone imagine that that's standard security protocol for a dignitary of any level, much less a president of the United States? A guy with a handgun sitting in that bus could have taken him out. I mean, look at this. This is the single most disgraceful proof of the Secret Service stand-down of protection for JFK during the motorcade, right there before your eyes as I speak. In addition, the motorcycle escort was cut down to 4 and ordered not to ride ahead of the rear wheels. Now, some of the officers are of special importance. I mean, there are only 4 of them, but I will mention in particular Bobby Hargis to the left rear on the inside and Douglas Jackson on the right, because their activities subsequently turned out to be extremely important and reasons why they had to so massively edit the film. In addition, of course, the motorcade route was altered on the 18th, just 4 days in advance. This is completely improper. The Secret Service lays down a motorcade route and they never change it because they have to investigate every occupant of every building. But as several have mentioned, there was no purported risk or threat to JFK within 50 miles of Dallas, which is a manifest absurdity. I mean, Dallas was a bastion of right-wing extremism. He was hated. H.L. Hunt was even distributing flyers of Jack Kennedy wanted for treason with mugshots. I mean, it was that bad. Madeline had an encounter with him in the parking lot behind the bank building where she worked as a young advertising executive and said, H.L., she said, you can't do that. And H.L. said, sure I can. I'm the richest man in the world. I can do anything I want. And by God, he did. Here is the most telling indication of all. The vehicles were in the wrong sequence. The presidential limousine was put up front. It should have been in the middle. It should have been preceded by a flatbed truck that would allow the photographers with their cameras to film this major political event. You should have begun with the mayor and then the vice president and work up in the order of the dignitaries. Otherwise, the crowd's going to cheer for Jack and Jackie, turn away and walk away, not even bother to witness the passage of the mayor or the vice president. Plus, although motorcades are characteristically uniform with black Cadillac limousines, in this instance they were makes of many different makes and models and colors. This was to ensure that the conspirators knew exactly who was where. The president's military aide, who normally sat in the front seat between William Greer, the driver, and Roy Kellerman, the agent in charge, was moved to the very last vehicle with the president's personal physician, Admiral Berkeley, to make it maximally difficult for him to reach the president should he need any emergency aid, and where the removal of the military aid was indispensable because otherwise he would have been hit with a bullet that passed through the windshield that hit Jack in the throat. And at Parkland, an agent got out with a bucket and sponge and began to wash the blood and brains out. A neighbor of the retired driver of the Secret Service vehicle, Sam Kenny, contacted me not only after Sam was deceased, but after his wife was deceased as well, to say that this was something that Sam Kenny had done that he didn't want the public to see the vehicle that way, but of course that's a ridiculous explanation. This was a crime scene on wheels, and this was a destruction of evidence. Just as when the vehicle was sent back to Ford and stripped down to bare metal and completely rebuilt was a destruction of a crime scene on wheels. Now, in 2003, I conducted a symposium on the Duluth campus of the University of Minnesota that led to the publication of the great Zapruder film hoax, a title that Jack White suggested. And it was superlative, and I'll just reflect some of the findings we have there. Here is one of two frames that Noel Twyman asked Roderick Ryan about, where Roderick Ryan was a cinematographic expert, and he asked Roderick why on the left was the foreground blurred and the front not, and on the right it wasn't blurred, and Roderick explained because they were following the vehicle on the left, which caused the background to be blurred, but on the right the vehicle was stationary, and therefore the background wasn't blurred. This was an early indication that the limousine had in fact been brought to a halt. Here's another report, and I'm going to have trouble reading it. Normally with my own computer, I'd have the text right here before my very eyes. This is Erwin Schwartz, who was a colleague of Zapruder, who had his dress company, Jennifer Jr., in the Dow Tex building. And Erwin Schwartz saw what appears to have been the original film. And when he was questioned by Noel about it, he reported, he was asked, did he see the president's brains blown out? He said, oh, yes, he did. You remember what direction? Oh, yes, to the left and to the rear. And Noel was very persistent about making sure he was being accurate in his depiction to the left and to the rear, but he was unwavering and emphatic. In addition, we had Secret Service agents who were nauseated when they saw the brains and gore on the trunk of the limousine. This is even after it was taken back to Washington, D.C. It was just covered with JFK's brains, and Secret Service agents found that very difficult to take. Now, John Costello has done this brilliant tutorial on the assassination, which you can also find at assassinationscience.com and other places, where he goes through the film and breaks it down into multiple different aspects, some of which I'm going to illustrate here as technical proofs derivative from the film that show that it was a fabrication, by which I mean the following. They took original footage and then edited it massively. They made up some new frames using these techniques of optical printing and special effects, and then reconstituted the film. And one of the features they had to accommodate was, and you frequently don't see it when the film is played, the sprocket hole images that you will have noticed at the top and bottom of the frame that may be unfamiliar to most of you. Those come from double exposures of one frame in relation to the next, so it creates a visual linkage of the frames together, so that if they had not reshot the frames to create the right sprocket hole images linking them together, the alteration of the film would have been obvious. So this is a very sophisticated operation they undertook.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll come to that. Now here is a striking indication of Life magazine actually breaking the plate of this page twice. Now, you may or may not know, but every issue of a magazine like Life comes off of one set of plates. Every single issue is produced by the same set of plates. And in this instance, they were so concerned with the caption, point 6, because they were wanting to claim that this single frame enabled us to determine the direction from which the shot had been fired. But any student of geometry knows it takes at least 2 points to create a line. So having 1 point, where he's hit really isn't sufficient. The blood spray, it turns out, was actually painted in. It disappears in the frame from the film in a single frame in 1/18 of a second, which would have been physically impossible had it been real. Now, what they did was to combine two hits. As I mentioned before, after the limousine was brought to a halt, and we have the umbrella man there pumping his umbrella means as a signal to everyone, all the shooting locations, that he's still alive, keep shooting. And then you have the Cuban step forward with a fist gesture, which is military for bring it to a halt, stop. Greer pulled the limo to a left, and it was an abrupt halt. He actually jostled the passengers forward. And oddly enough, I think they must have felt too many witnesses might have noticed that jostling forward. They actually use frames from the abrupt halt as part of what's supposed to be an acceleration sequence after frame 313. I mean, it's an oddity you don't notice unless you pay a lot of attention, but it's absolutely there. So what they did was, because JFK, when he was hit in the back of the head, and this was by one of 3 shots that were fired from the Dow Tex, he slumped forward. Jackie eased him back up. She was looking him right in the face when he was hitting approximately the right temple by that frangible or exploding bullet that blew open the skull flap and blew his brains out the back of his already weakened cranium with such force that when they hit motorcycle officer Bobby Hargis there, he initially thought he himself had been shot. It was that forceful. And so they combined the two. And what Jack did after that was to slump to the left. In other words, initially slump forward. And this is, of course, what got Dan Rather in trouble, because he'd actually been there Saturday morning when Zapruder showed the film. He got rushed out and said Jack, had gone forward, which was true of the original film. But when Robert Groden eventually got it on the Geraldo's, program in 1975, it of course had been edited, and you didn't have anything of the slumping forward. You only had the violent back into the left. No one in Dealey Plaza observed a violent back into the left because he simply slumped to the left. They took out too many frames. They took out so many frames that you got this violent back into the left motion that was not a part of the original sequence. And here indeed, and this was, frankly, these 2 images are from Josiah Thompson's 6 Seconds in Dallas, published in 1967. This was the best part of his book. It was a scientific, completely objective, even mathematically precise proof of at least 2 shots, one from behind, another from in front, conclusively establishing the existence of at least 2 shooters and therefore of a conspiracy. As we began to approach the 50th, and I'd had many encounters with Josiah Thompson, he began backing away from any evidence of conspiracy in his book. And it was evident to me, and I actually published this, that he was going to renounce conspiracy on the eve of the 50th, which was supposed to mean that even the conspiracy theorists have given it up, see. He did the first of what were going to be 20, 30, 40, 50 short little interviews with a very famous filmmaker that were being promoted by the New York Times. And he was talking about Umbrella Man and trying to say it was all totally innocuous and it had to do with Dean Acheson or it had something to do with appeasement, which it had nothing to do. But I mean, here was Tink, saying you got to be careful because even something that looks suspicious may have an innocuous explanation. And I just raked him over the coals in that in an article entitled JFK, the CIA and the New York Times, which, check it out. I mean, they ceased. I think they saw that they were actually losing ground because they were giving opportunities for critiques, and I was seizing them. So they discontinued what was going to be an ongoing series of interviews with this famous filmmaker, with Josiah Thompson. But it was clear what he was doing, clear to me, so I explained it all to the public. Now, meanwhile, David Lifton had gone up to Caltech and taken photographs of these frames 3, 11, 12, 13 through 17 and all that to Richard Feynman, the most famous physicist in the world. And Feynman, genius that he is, simply took a ruler and started, these were big prints, simply took a ruler and started measuring, and he himself discovered the double hit right there in the frames that David Lifton had taken to him. So even if Josiah were supposed to be disavowing his double hit theory from his book, I say again, by far the best part, Richard Feynman had independently established it. I mean, David Lifton did some absolutely brilliant research, and I regard my 3 collections of expert studies, Assassination Science, 1998, Murder in Dealey Plaza, 2000, The Great Zapruder Film Hoax, 2003, as sequels to David Lifton's best evidence. Now, with regard to the head wound, they blacked out the head wound in early frames. They altered the x-rays to prove that it didn't exist. But when I reviewed later frames, I found it in frame 374. In other words, a reason they were so fixated on these early frames, maybe they overlooked something, and I proved to be right. Here you take a look. This is 317, and you see that the back of the head is blacked out. In fact, it's abnormally blacked out. Judith has friends in Hollywood who are film restoration experts. At one point, I believe they were going to participate here and explain the results of their research, where they obtained a forensic copy of the Zapruder film from the National Archives. Sidney Wilkerson is the person who's been in charge of this effort. I've actually visited their studio. I saw the film they were dealing with. It was stunningly clear and pristine, and they were all shocked by the amateurish way in which this wound had been blacked out. It appears they blew up the frame. They actually painted it out in black, and then shrunk the frame back and then reshot the sequence. That it was that level of crudity. But here you can see in frame 374 what I discovered. You can actually see the blowout. Now you see why I mentioned that skull flap, because you notice that pink extension on the right? That's not his ear, that's that skull flap that was blown open. But the wound itself, of course, is the blue-gray area, right? Remember how often they refer to brains as gray matter? Well, there's a reason for that, because it's the color that it is observed to be during surgery. Now here's some comparison of a couple of earlier frames with frame 374. Now, more than 60 witnesses reported seeing the limousine come to a halt. Some said they saw it slow dramatically. Others said they saw it come to a complete halt, where it slowed dramatically as it came to a complete halt. And the stop was such an obvious indication of Secret Service complicity, it had to be taken out. Here we get some of the reports, and I would read it if I can read it from here at the angle. This was Tony Foster, who was being interviewed by Deborah Conway, and I think Deborah had no idea what Tony was going to say, because Deborah, in my view, is not a truth seeker, but a truth obfuscator. And here she got a wonderful testimony from Tony Foster, who had never seen the extant Zapruder film, just talking about how they brought the limousine to a halt. They did. They brought it to a halt. I don't know why they brought it to a halt, but they brought it to a halt. And Tony is just one of many, many witnesses who reported the limousine being brought to a halt. Here are some others. You even had Billy Lovelady, who was actually standing beside Lee Oswald in the doorway with his hand up, protecting his eyes from the sun. Larry Rivera has done the most stunning confirmation, to which many major contributions are made by Ralph Sinkay, who was the first to persuade me that it wasn't the face that was most important, it was the height, the weight, the build, the clothing, the shirt, the t-shirt. Claire Kuhn made an invaluable contribution by talking about the black tie man in front of and behind, which is an optical impossibility. Judith did a brilliant job of comparing the sleeves. Well, there are others here. Roy Truly talking about the Mrs. Earl Cabell talking about the stop, but there's so much more I need to cover. Even Clint confirmed a fist-sized blowout at the back of the head. You can see it. You can see it defined by Jackie's white glove and crucial flames. The X-rays were altered to complement blacking out the wound. Larry Rivera realized that Jackie's gloves made a background for it. This is Clint Hill talking about having seen a fist-sized blowout at the back of the head when he gave a talk about this new book at Warwick's in San Diego. Here's a comparison of the Nix and the Zapruder, where you see Jackie going further out on the back of the trunk in the Nix than she does in the Zapruder. So, they use the Zapruder as a guide to alter the other films, especially the Nix, but they didn't get it right. Then we have here, the stunning sentence from the book about the bloody fist-sized hole in the back of the head. I mean, this is coming from Clint Hill, who was the first guy to observe it when he lay across her bodies, saw this gaping, bloody wound, and turned to his colleagues and gave them a thumbs down because it was fatal. Now here you compare where David discovered they patched the x-rays, and notice how close is the area P for patch he defined on the left with the actual hole you can see in frame 374. Here is the actual 374, 375. Maybe this is why they missed it, see? I mean, it's from Jack. You gotta zoom in on Jack lying there on the seat when Jackie's climbing out in the back. And here you can see now with her white glove, and Larry discerned this, that you actually get a definition of the defect, which is very substantial. And here's another. You can see her glove, her right hand versus her left hand. Here you can see again a definition in relation to her glove. Here you can see another. This is just one more brilliant contribution by Larry Rivera. And here he used something called Blender, which gives you a kind of a 3D image of a 2D phenomenon. And look at the size of that gap right in the middle of the area. Larry's doing much more with Blender these days, and it's going to make a major contribution to new technology, enable us to get a better fix on the details of the crime. The sign was replaced. In comparison to photos of the location and dimensions of the Stemmons freeway sign revealed it was replaced by misplaced images. This is from John Costella's work. Although not as important as other proofs, it demonstrates the revision of the film was extensive. And here you just look, see the comparison between the sign and what's in the film, the sign what's in the film, the sign what's in the film. This GIF, see now you see it growing there, how much the discrepancy is between when they located the sign back into the film in relation to its actual location. The assassination scenario, JFK was hit at least 4 times, as I've explained. There were at least 6 shooters who fired 8 to 10 shots. Here we get, the famous Alchins, and in the background you have the Lee in the doorway that Larry has so brilliantly exposed. In the very first presentation, believe me, if you missed that, once you see this presentation, there's not going to be any doubt in your mind. This is the most thorough, scientific, methodical, comprehensive, and definitive study of the man in the doorway ever envisioned by the mind of man. It's a superior piece of work. And here's what the shooting sequence was actually like. You have those greens were from what appears to be from the top of the county records building, though we have new Bell film footage that suggests there might also have been a shot from lower down in the records building. 3 shots fired from the Dow Tex. You have the shot that was hit the windshield from the lower right. Actually, Larry and I and Gary King 2 years ago went down to the triple underpass, and it looks now that shot actually originated from inside the triple underpass. The shot that hit Jack in the right temple actually was fired by at above ground sewer opening at the intersection of the triple underpass and the picket fence by Frank Sturgis, who may have been the best shot in the world at the time. I know the Gold Shield detective from New York City, Jim Rothstein, who arrested him when he came to New York to murder Marita Lorenz, so she couldn't testify before the HSCA, and he put a gun to his head when he came in. While they were talking, he used a throwaway line. He said, "Nice shooting," and Sturgis admitted that he'd been aiming for his eye, but he moved slightly and he hit him in the temple instead, and that he'd done it because he had betrayed the brigade at the Bay of Pigs and because he'd been cavorting with beautiful women who were spies for East Germany. The limo stop scenario, during the stop he was hit at least twice in the head, as I've explained. Officer Baker actually dismounted his bike and ran between the cars to the grassy knoll. Officer Jackson rode his bike up on the grassy knoll. 5 Secret Service agents surrounded the presidential limousine. Let me give you the background here. Larry Rivera again rediscovered interviews with the motorcycle patrolman and their supervisor, Stavis Ellis, that Fred Newcomb had commissioned to be done, and went through the excruciating process of transcribing them because they had difficult accents to determine. But we've been able to establish that that's what happened. Get this from Newsweek magazine. David and I discussed this semantic about how Newsweek knew that actually where all the shooting took place and so forth was further down Elm Street. The official X is not where JFK was shot. It was more nearly opposite the stairway. This is a more accurate. So get this. This is just a frame from the Knicks to give you an idea of what we're talking about with the motorcycle men. you look a little closer, I tried to kind of, you know, do something as a preliminary. We're going to make Larry principally a definitive recounting, a reconstruction of the entire assassination scenario. But here you see sketching, you know, what happened. That you had Baker, who, remember, had been hit with that debris, getting off his bike, running between the limousines, which he could not have done were they not stationary, up the grassy knoll. Officer Jackson motoring up onto the grassy knoll until his bike falls over. 5 guys getting out of the Secret Service limousine and surrounding the JFK. One of them takes a chunk of skull from a little boy and throws it in the back seat. So here you have something approximating, but you know, with time, we'll give you a much better visual rendition. I just want you to understand. You know, so remember, at the same time, Clint Hill's rushing up, pushing Jackie back. She's gone after a big chunk of Jack's skull and brains. She holds it in her hand all the way to Parkland. After they have pried his moribund body out of her arms, she collects herself and comes into trauma room number 1. She turns to the anesthesiologist, Pepper Jenkins, extends her hand and asks, "Will this help?" Now here, if you look at the grassy knoll, you can see indications of Officer Jackson's motorbike going there. Here are some other indications where it may be more clear. We have more, but you got these motorcycle wheel marks right on the grassy knoll. None of this is seen in the Zapruder film. None of this is seen in the Zapruder film. But you can see now why. I mean, you got officers rushing up to the grassy knoll. Why would they do that if shots were fired from above and behind? Why would the Secret Service have stopped? Why would they rush out? What's this getting this piece of skull from a little boy? They had to conceal all of that. He even found in the Oklahoma City Times a report about a motorcycle officer riding pell-mell up the grassy knoll. I mean, it actually made it in at least one newspaper report. Here are 2 videos you can find online. The JFK Horseman Part 1, the JFK Horseman Part 2. These are from the new JFK show, which we've done with Larry, Don Fox, and Gary King, and where you can find most of our new shows at the Gary King YouTube channel. Here are a couple of key quotes about it, you know, where there's some individuals, including Josiah Thompson and Robert Groden, who have insisted that the film is authentic. Josiah's argument was that the chain of custody didn't allow it to be altered, which overlooks the obvious, namely that those who had custody of the film were complicit. These were Secret Service agents who were involved. We know now from Doug Horn's masterful work that the original, as an 8mm already split film, was taken to the National Photographic Interpretation Center on Saturday. They had to have a shop owner open his store to obtain an 8mm film so they could watch it. The substitute, a 16mm unsplit film, was brought down from Kodak by an agent who identified himself as William Smith, and the substitution was made. Different crews were working on Saturday and Sunday, and for the most part, until they were interviewed by Doug Horn, none of them were the wiser. And we now know, you know, a whole lot about what's going on here, and of course I gave you several links, and one of them is to an article, is the Zapruder film. Jack White was concerned that Zapruder was supposed to be up there with Marilyn Sutzman, his secretary, but it wasn't obvious to him that he could actually even film with Sutzman in the way. Hence the top of the great Zapruder film hoax is showing, you know, the oddity that Jack was the first to detect. I'm therefore dedicating my presentation here to Jack White today, but the answer to the question, did Zapruder film? The Zapruder film is, of course, no, because no one filmed a film that was manufactured in a laboratory. Just a couple of quick takes by way of closing. We have the famous photograph. I got to know Chauncey Hope, the short guy in the lower right, who actually had identified everyone there as being involved in Operation Mongoose. We knew that Rafael Cruz was in New Orleans. That is Rafael Cruz. We analyzed this on the new JFK show, but look at this. On my own first book, Assassination Science, lo and behold, I used a famous color photograph from a Dallas Morning News photographer in the upper right-hand corner. Who was there? Rafael Cruz with Antonio Veciana, who is the founder of Alpha 66, one of the most vicious anti-caste organizations of all. The improbability that he could have been at both locations at these times and not been involved in the assassination is approximately 0. Here I point out, Ollie does such brilliant work. We have been collaborating on a series of books where I edit the books and Ollie puts them together and designs the covers. And I cite this one in particular from Orlando to Dallas and beyond because Ollie has a fabulous essay there that is the final essay in the book. And we now are putting our books out with color photographs. And there are over 400 photographs in that particular volume. Ollie's essay runs 50 pages or so. If you want to get more details and specifics and more evidence, it even includes, if you look at the back cover there, the two bottom center and right photographs. In Nice, Ollie didn't show it. They actually had mannequins in the street. Those weren't bodies, those were mannequins. We documented here, they appear to have had a pig out there. They gutted in order to get blood in the street. This is an elaborate charade. If you're interested, these are books on, this is serious conspiracy research being published. I bring together a dozen or 15 experts on Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, the moon landing, 9/11. You can find it there, Moonrock Books. And I closed by observing that about maybe a year ago, I was interviewed by the BBC and they did a preliminary interview and it looked like they were pretty interested in what we had discovered about 9/11. And I happened to record that. When they actually did the interview with me, however, they were very hostile and trying to debunk 9/11. I wasn't able to record that because they had it done in a way that wouldn't allow me to do so, or I could have shown how they edited what I had to say. But I liked so much from the preliminary that I went ahead and put together, this is 17 minutes, why I, Jim Fetzer, am a conspiracy theorist. And let me say, just as evidence of how we're actually getting out, this coming Wednesday I will have the first episode of a new show on the Progressive Radio Network, FM, as well as internet. This is a big deal. This is Gary Knowles Network as the conspiracy guy. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, my first show is going to be about JFK, and I will be discussing research that was presented here in Dallas at Judah's splendid conference. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. James Fetzer. That was amazing.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, sure.
James Chaney.
Out in front of his very eyes, I was dumbfounded.
So what I'm saying is actually verified the Warren Commission testimony by Curry, Decker, and Winston Lawson.
No, I know the story. I know the story. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing it up. Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning Marita Lorenz and Frank Sturgis. We're reminded that this is a year we lost Mark Lane, who passed away.
Yes.
Who gave us rush to judgment, plausible denial, and last word.
Yes.
And he actually had E. Howard Hunt in a courtroom.
Yes.
Where testimony pointed out Hunt as a paymaster, not just a bench warmer.
That's right.
And as an investigator, the only thing the prior speaker I would agree with is, as an investigator, I think James Files, when I see his interview, having interviewed hundreds of people, he speaks as if a man speaking.
Well, let me tell you about Files.
He speaks as if a man speaking from memory.
Let me tell you from memory. Let me tell you about Files. When it first came out, Confessions of an Assassination, I was asked by a local TV station to comment on it. They wanted to put me on the air. So I went through it, and I gave him an 80% truth rating. And I see 80% of what he said was true. But the idea that he would be invited to participate in the assassination of the president the morning of the event is a manifest absurdity. This thing was set up well in advance. It was even rehearsed. Not only that, but when he described his shot, he didn't mention the limo stop, but the limo stop set it up. If he'd actually been there, he would have mentioned the limo stop. He did claim to use the Remington Fireball, and I find the weapon more interesting, but I've concluded James Files, although he knew a great deal about it, was in fact not there.
I need to use that.
Sure.
Couple of minor corrections and facts in your presentation.
Sure, go for it.
I set up the interview with Erwin Schwartz for Noel Twyman at Ask 1994, and because he's my wife's uncle. And Dan Rather saw the film on Monday, not Saturday. Irwin ran the projector at Zapruder's office. He did not run the projector Monday, and Dan Rather was never there when he ran the projector. So Dan Rather saw the film in Sam Passman's office the same day he made the report, and Dan Rather says in his bio, he saw the film and then ran back to the studio.
Right. Yeah, very good. Excellent comments. I probably wouldn't have missed the one if I actually had the images here before me as I normally do. But because I have a new computer and the adapter to connect to the player didn't fit, we had to, just rig it. Any other questions, anyone? I just want to thank you all and just say I chaired a co-chaired 5 national conferences. I think Judy has topped every one of those. This has just been superb.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. James Fetzer.